Okay, so I was tortured by not being told I wasn't recording, so this is going to be a recap of what I've already covered with you guys. So pardon me if I bore you. So I transitioned from Zoser's pyramid, right, to the Great Pyramids because the Pyramid of Zoser was, the sort of first time that something like that had been attempted, okay, and was successfully attempted. So when we think of the Egyptians, we think about the Great Pyramids, and that's the sort of image that we have, right? And we're going to take a look at the Great Pyramid of Cheops. So the Great Pyramid of Cheops was constructed about 2500 BCE, right? It was supposed to be, it's thought to be designed by the architect Imhotep. Imhotep is the first architect in recorded history, okay? He was also a priest in addition to being the architect. He was very keen on pure geometry, and the angle of the sides of the Pyramid of Cheops are about 51.42 degrees, all right, from the ground. So, and they're very precisely constructed. There was a finish layer, and as Gail pointed out to me, it wasn't marble, it was limestone, okay, that was placed over top of the other blocks. Gail also mentioned that most of the limestone was actually removed from the pyramids to build the mosques of the region. So he said some of it may have even ended up at the Taj Mahal. So, anyway, looking at some of the key things to understand that are important about the pyramids are the axial alignment of spaces and shafts, and the statue chambers, and the hollowing out of chambers inside of the pyramid. Okay, I'll click here, and here we see a view of the Great Pyramids and the Queen's Pyramids in the foreground. At the top of that one, that's something I didn't note before, you can still see the finish layer at the top of that pyramid, right? So imagine that the rough, coarse texture that you're seeing on these would have been absolutely smooth coming down, with the finish layer coming all the way down to the ground, okay? So we talked, we looked at it. These next two images are going to show sort of a section cut through the pyramid that shows, right, how they were subtractively composed internally to create spaces. And you can see that there's kind of this hierarchy. The king's chamber is at the top, queen's chamber is in the middle, the burial chamber is down at the bottom. And again, remember, these were intended to be the homes in the afterlife. So the burial chamber is where the remains would go, but the spirit of the king and queen would sort of live inside of these rooms. I mentioned, as we were talking about this earlier, this notion that these air shafts, some of which are aligned exactly with the position of some stars, which to me is a baffling thing. The air shafts also had a functional reason, okay? And that is that if you build some sort of a slot like this, right, that if there are people inside working and the oxygen runs out because you're breathing all of it, right, there's no way of replenishing the oxygen, the people die. So if there are air shafts, right, they allow this idea of convection, warm air and cool air kind of move in a cycle, and it keeps the air replenished so that people don't die inside of it. Here's another image showing the Temple of Cheops and the Queen's pyramids in the foreground. There's the mortuary complex. You see all of the shafts and stuff that are cut down into it. But there's one more thing that I pointed out, which is this causeway. Okay, the causeway leads down to the temple complex, which is down by the river. Okay, and the causeway was set up because the river would flood, and it was very predictable where it would rise to. All right, you see that there's this idea of a boat pit down in here, and that's because most of the time this is dry, but when it would flood, the water would come up to the base of the pyramids. Okay. Next picture, we kind of take a look at just the scale of things. If you kind of squint at it, you get an idea of this coarse, gigantic pyramid, right? But when you look down closely, you see a human being standing next to some of these blocks. All right. And you look at the size of the blocks so far up that they're starting to turn into like what look like little pebbles. And you start to get an idea of just how massive this thing is. I mentioned to you guys the idea that this pyramid is huge, 480 feet. So if we took this pyramid and magically transported it into downtown LA, it would be taller than a large portion of the towers that are down there. There's only a few towers that would be taller than it. And it would encompass an area probably almost the size of where the big towers are located. So here is the a sort of picture of the location of the basic pyramids. This was one of the pyramids that we were looking at down here. Here's the causeway from the pyramid of Khafra coming down to the Valley Temple. All right, this was down by the river, but when the river would flood, it would come up. And this is uneven land. So this is not a flat plain. This has differentiation in it. So these pyramids are actually up higher, right, than this pyramid down in here. So that's one of the things that is kind of deceiving when you look at it. But if you look at this image, one of the things that should be striking is all of these mastabas, right? The originators of the pyramid. And there's hundreds of them all around it. This is an actual aerial view looking at the pyramids. You can see all of the mastabas in the foreground. And you see Cairo in the background back there, in the Nile. So the pyramids were one of the key sort of things that we associate with the Egyptians. Okay? A second thing that we associate with the Egyptians is this idea of a temple. Okay? And part of the pyramids and the causeway that led down to the temple, you would see that the causeway led to this temple complex that had these sort of key characteristics. Okay? And these key characteristics are things that you should know about the temples. And the Egyptian temples literally will become the predecessor to what most of our Western church architecture would become. Okay? So some of the key things that you guys should know are this idea of large and open courtyards. Okay? The idea that some portions of the complex would be roofed, right, over columns, that there were these pillared and colonnaded hallways that led through them, and the axial arrangement of spaces inside of the temple complex. A lot of these things you start to see, right, being kind of an adaptation of what you saw already going on in the pyramids. So here we see the big pyramid in the background, the causeway coming down, and the Sphinx located down at the base. The Sphinx is actually next to the temple complex. Okay. One of the interesting things about the Sphinx is that when it was discovered, right, the only thing that they saw was the head, because sand had drifted over the course of 4,000 years and had covered everything. You can sort of see the sort of coloration difference, right, and the weathering difference. So the sand had literally piled up, and what was sticking out of the sand was the Sphinx's head. In the next picture, you'll actually see part of the excavation, and you can see the sort of sand all around the Sphinx. There's a camel, right, and a couple of guys, and you get an idea of how big the Sphinx is in relationship to those. There is some theories that say that the head of the Sphinx is the head of one of the pharaohs, I think Corfu, but that's debatable. It was supposed to be this fearsome guardian, right, of the city of the dead, where the pyramids were located. Here you see kind of a plan view of the complex. This is the complex that would be down by the river, okay, and you can see that it's connected through the causeway that comes across here. This is a shortened view of it. Here is a pictorial image of what it might look like when it wasn't flooded. So this is at the normal level of the river. When it would flood, it would come up towards the pyramids. Okay? Now we move on to Upper Egypt, which is below on the map. All right? Let's see how many minutes we're at. We're at 9 minutes. Okay. So in Upper Egypt, there are some key places that I mentioned that you guys would be looking at. So Luxor, the Valley of the Queens and Kings, and Karnak. All right. So here is kind of a Google Earth view of it, and you kind of see the Temple of Karnak adjacent to the river. Okay, the Temple of Luxor over here, Temple of Ramses across the way, and then King Tut's tomb all the way up at the top. Another one that's going to be really important is, and I always have a hell of a time pronouncing, is Hatshepsut, right? Queen Hatshepsut's temple complex and mortuary complex. So we'll be looking at those momentarily. Here's what it looked like before there was a city on the other side of the river, okay? This is the Nile River. This is a drawing dating back to when the first Egyptologists started studying Egyptian artifacts and history. And you can see that this temple complex sat directly adjacent to the Nile River. One of the key things, one of the landmark sort of buildings in this temple complex, or the temple complexes that are further up in the upper Nile, is this temple of Queen Hatshepsut. Tongue twister. Hatshepsut. You guys get the picture. Just phonetically pronounce it. Hatshepsut. Shepsut. Hatshepsut. Okay, so.
I spelled it differently on the other side.
Did I? I don't know. Hatshepsut.
There's a P, not a T on the other one.
Is there? Oh, it's not listed there. It's probably here.
Yeah, it's a P.
Hatshepsut. I don't know which the correct spelling is.
Hatshepsut sounds like a cheap suit place.
I don't know. I don't know. Anyway, so some of the key things about this, right, is that this complex is the first sort of use of a heavily colonnaded structure, right? So before this, we saw colonnaded structures that were attached to walls. But here we see an actual predecessor to the Greek pyramids that we'll study in the next culture that we're getting to, okay? And part of the reason for that is that they hired the predecessors of the Greeks to come carve these columns, okay? It's less about one centralized mass and more about a larger composition and complex that has a series of sort of axial arrangements. It incorporates this idea of procession, of like going from place to place to place in a certain pathway, right? This notion of approach and anticipation, and there's a proportion that we see in these buildings that are really out of character with what we saw in some of the other buildings, okay? And then there's this idea of these proto-Doric columns. You guys don't know what Doric columns are just yet, but the Doric column is one of the early columns of the Greeks. It's considered to be like this iconic emblem of Greek ancient architecture. So here is an actual image of the temple, and you can see the axial arrangements. You can see the rampways. You can see the heavily colonnaded sort of spaces, the open courts and the interior courts. And you can see that this particular complex is carved into a mountainside. Okay? Which incidentally I wanted to bring up. I didn't mention it when we were talking about the Sphinx, but the way that the Sphinx was originated is that when they were quarrying the stone out, that they carved the Sphinx as they were quarrying the stone for the pyramids and the temples. Okay? So I think I better stop it here so that I don't exceed my 15-minute limit that YouTube imposes on me.